strongly suggest getting the recently released book, Armed Struggle, Panthers, Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. And this phenomenal piece of work is written by my first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is one of the most prolific writers of our time, and he is the author of Armed Struggle, Black Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back to Inside the Issues. And you were with us last week, and thanks for joining us this week.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me ask you this. First of all, why the question mark? Why armed struggle as opposed to armed struggle?
Well, because as your opening comment suggests, the Black Panthers were involved in more than carting arms. Mm-hmm. That was just an aspect of a wider agenda. And I wanted to even so interrogate their carting of arms, because there are those who today feel that picking up the gun, to use the phrase of that era, was a fool's errand. And they tend to discredit or dismiss the Panthers as a result. So I wanted to problematize, if you like, that cardinal concept by adding a question mark.
And just quickly to that point, that they also dismissed then the effects of the Deacons for Defense, as well as Richard Williams and his book, Negroes with Guns.
Oh, Robert F. Williams.
Robert, yes, I'm sorry, Robert, yes.
Who also, by the way, initiated Radio Free Dixie, Socialist Cuba, which broadcasts into Dixie at a time of fraught relations between the United States and the island in the Caribbean. And of course, as many in your audience know, because of our atrocious climate that we've had to face, speaking of Black people, picking up the gun was not something that was unknown. Recall Nat Turner, circa August 1831 in Southampton, Virginia, leading an armed uprising against enslavement. John Brown in Western Virginia, October 1859, leading a multiracial band against that peculiar institution. And then there were other episodes. I recount in the book what happens in the 1920s in Detroit with the Black physician, Dr. Sweet, who picked up arms to repel a home invasion by terrorists and racists. This led to a major fundraising campaign of the NAACP, because I think that somehow buried in the psyche of many of our people is the idea that if we are to decisively defeat these demons and devils that have been tormenting us, that sterner stuff may be necessary, and that sterner stuff may involve picking up the gun.
Before we get into the details of this phenomenal work, I just stated, if you are interested in gaining a clearer understanding of the history and reality and how that history and reality impacts our politics today, I strongly suggest getting the book. Are there any correlations between this incredibly well-researched, and I must say for you, lived history, and the politics that we find ourselves grappling with today?
Oh, sure. I mean, I just wrote an email to a friend remarking that despite this phenomenal summit that took place in China this past week between 4 dozen plus African nations, heads of state and heads of government and their entourages and the Chinese leadership, that has created barely a buzz in Black America, even though you have many people in Black America who style themselves as Pan-Africanists and Black nationalists and are pushing a reparations agenda that inevitably will involve support from the international community. And at the same time, percolating on the back burner is this simmering crisis between Egypt and Ethiopia that could eventuate in war in coming days, weeks, and or months. And despite the presence of these aforementioned Pan-Africanists and Black nationalists, it's hardly on their radar. And this would not have been the case with regard to the Black Panther Party, which, after all, had a legation in Algiers, North Africa, which sent delegations regularly to the country then known as the People's Republic of the Congo, across the Congo River from the larger Congo. I'm referring to what is now referred to as Congo-Brazzaville, routinely sent delegations to Vietnam, the then Soviet Union, China, etc. And when the US authorities and their own missteps contributed to the demise of the Black Panther Party, liquidated along with us with it was a certain internationalism. And that dearth of internationalism has been our bane. It helps to account for why we are subjected to this epidemic of police killings, which have numbed many, all too many in our community. And so obviously there's a connection between this book and what has befallen us today.
In fact, you mentioned the dearth of internationalism that has been our bane. And when you said that, the immediate thought that came to mind to me was how many of us African Americans still don't understand the correlation between the genocide that's being committed in Gaza and our plight today. We don't understand the power of internationalizing our plight, which is what Dr. King did, which is what Malcolm did, which is what Du Bois did, which is what Robeson did, so many others before us. We want to, I was at the DNC and was asked by many people, well, as I raised the issue of Gaza, what's the relevance between what's happening there and here? Not understanding that the leadership of the Black Panther Party met with Arafat, went to not Lebanon, but the training camps in was it Lebanon that they went to?
Yes.
Okay, so quickly, am I off base with that?
No, I'm afraid to say that your dim-witted interlocutors are the ones who are off base. What's remarkable about Black America today is that despite the attacks on DEI, diversity,
equity, and inclusion,
equity, despite the attacks on affirmative action, we have upped the ante by pushing for reparations for enslavement of Africans, which is bold and audacious. But obviously, if that's to become a reality, as opposed to just a talking point, it's going to have to be internationalized. And yet, while you're at the DNC, people are questioning why you're raising international issues. I think part of it is this contradiction between the self-styled posture of Black Americans and our reality. The self-styled posture based upon enslavement, Jim Crow terror, et cetera, is that we always have to see ourselves as being on the offensive, as not taking no stuff, as being two-fisted brawlers. At the same time, when it comes to executing that militant posture in order to win concessions, we're oftentimes little more than marshmallows.
Well, and as we get ready to pause for to that point, we're always told, not now. Don't ask that now. Don't make any demands right now. Oh my goodness. If you try to hold Barack Obama to account, oh my goodness. If you ask Kamala Harris a substantive question that's based on policy, you must be a Trumpian. How dare you? Don't do that. Anyway, with that, 15, we're at 15 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. And this is all the things you are. This is from Hawkins, Alive at the Village Gate, a 1963 Verve release. You got Coleman Hawkins on tenor, Tommy Flanagan piano, Major Holly on bass, and Eddie Locke on drums. Do yourselves a favor. We're talking to Dr. Gerald Horne about armed struggle, Panthers, Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Do yourselves a favor. Keep it locked right here. Sirius XM 126 Urban View. That's the Hawk. That's the Hawk. Coleman Hawkins on tenor. Tommy Flanagan, piano, Major Holly bass, Eddie Locke on drums. That's Hawkins alive at the Village Gate, 63 Verve. And I tell you what, that brother right there could swing and hard. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. The book, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s is the book. And it's great research, as you always find with Dr. Horne. Gerald, thank you so much for staying with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Armed Struggle, you write, what would drive a core of African Americans to take up arms? It must be stressed that the Black Panther Party initially picked up the gun in self-defense, and let me add, the official name was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. But for various reasons, this morphed into an offensive approach, i.e., armed struggle, to conquer their ultimate foe. So who was or what was the ultimate foe, and what were the motivating factors and or forces that led to this change?
The motivating forces and factors are what still bedevils us to a degree today. I'm speaking of police terror in the first instance. The Black Panther Party was initiated in the state of California. It had one of its strongest chapters in the Southland, the geographical subject of my book, speaking of the area centered around the city and county of Los Angeles, where the notorious LAPD still reigns. Some in your audience may be familiar with what befell Black motorist Rodney King in the early 1990s in Los Angeles. In a typical incident, he was captured on camera being pummeled into submission, if you like, by officers of the state. Another critical aspect of the terror inflicted on Black people in the Southland, which I may actually turn into another book, is arson. That is to say, these plug uglies and rowdies and racists, oftentimes in a kind of what might be called euphemistically aggressive gentrification, would torch Black families in certain neighborhoods to drive them out. In fact, if you look at the history of Palm Springs, due east of Los Angeles, now a kind of citadel for stars and former presidents, et cetera, for decades, it had a thriving Black community before they were driven out by the torch, if you like. And so it was that kind of terror that led to the rise of the Black Panther Party. And I might also say that they were deeply influenced by armed struggle that was unfolding in Southern Africa with the African National Congress, and Mozambique with Frelimo, and Angola with MPLA, et cetera, not to mention the US wars in Indochina, where the Vietnamese and their comrades were fighting back with force of arms against US imperialism, which of course was the ultimate foe being confronted by the Panthers here in North America.
In fact, I remember having a conversation with Bobby Seale. It was when Nelson Mandela passed, and I wanted to get the perspective of one revolutionary giving his analysis and perspective on another revolutionary. And in preparing for that interview, since you mentioned the ANC, I looked at the ANC platform and the Black Panther Party platform and found that they were incredibly similar. And Bobby Seale told me that the Black Panthers use the ANC platform as their template.
And of course, Bobby Seale was a founder of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, circa October 1966, along with his comrade, Huey P. Newton. They developed the aforementioned 10-point program. And by the way, coming out of this heralded Africa-China summit just unfolding in the last 72 hours was another 10-point program, which I'm afraid to say many in our community are unaware of, oblivious to, but is a subject of much debate and interrogation on the African continent, which we claim we're attached to.
And in the earlier opening, I talked about how well researched this book is, and it's a lived history for you. There's a guy in the book. He's referenced by the name Jerry Horne. Who is Jerry Horne, and why is he relevant to all of this history, to these dynamics?
Well, I'm afraid to say that that person is yours truly.
Ah,
I'm not as young as I look, Wilmer. In
really?
fact, in the summer of 1969, I first visited Oakland for a Black Panther Party conference on fascism, which marked a turning point in the history of the U.S. left, because that was the moment in which the Black Panther Party was asserting leadership, not only of the Black left, but the entire U.S. left. By June 1970, I had arrived in San Francisco to reside because I was going to be attending law school at the University of California. And at the University of California, Berkeley, of course, that was where the Black Panther Party began to raise its funds by selling Mao's Little Red Book in front of the campus beginning in October 1966. And then under the aegis of the Panther Party, I began teaching at a state prison just north of Berkeley. And one of my students was a man then known as Donald DeFreeze, who I lent my prized copy of the book by Frederick Engels, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. I never received the book back because he went up in flames in a shootout in Los Angeles a few years later under the aegis of an organization then known as the Symbionese Liberation Army. Of course, the lesson I carted away is to be careful about who you lend your books to.
Oh, you're right. By the early 70s, the state hosted a prison empire, the largest in the world, with a population of 28,400 convicted felons. What role did the California prison industrial complex play in the development of these politics?
It played a critical role. A number of the Panther leaders were recruited from prison. They were prone to be receptive to their message because of the atrocities they were facing. I'm thinking not only of Eldridge Cleaver, who had served hard time in Folsom and San Quentin before being released in December 1966, but then driven into exile by the end of 1968, assuming the leadership of the legation in Algiers, North Africa, shortly thereafter. I'm thinking of George Jackson, who you may recall was a field marshal of the Black Panther Party, served hard time in San Quentin. His younger brother, Jonathan Jackson, a precocious teenager, led an assault on a Marin County courthouse north of San Francisco in August 1970, shortly after, recall, I had arrived in the San Francisco Bay Area and was killed in the process along with others in this action. And then George Jackson himself was slain under still mysterious circumstances in August 1971, leading to an uprising in Attica State Prison a few weeks later that has been the subject of both prize-winning books and documentary films and all the rest. So as I tell the story, the prisons were a major recruiting ground for the Panthers, but also campuses. That is to say that the state of California began building campuses at a breakneck speed, particularly under the leadership of then Governor Pat Brown, the father of subsequent Governor Jerry Brown. And campuses became a recruiting ground for many working class intellectuals, including myself, for example. And then there was the Army, because an untold story has been how the Panthers were able to get a lot of their arms from disgruntled Black soldiers in Camp Pendleton, south of Los Angeles, and Fort Ord, south of Oakland from returning disgruntled Vietnam War veterans crossing the Pacific back into the Golden State. And then there were factories, because there were many proletarianized intellectuals as well who were flocking to the ranks of the Black Panther Party. And those critical institutions, prisons, campuses, the military, factories, helped to generate a considerable percentage of the membership of this Black radical organization.
You just mentioned, as we look at recruiting and where entities such as the Panthers recruited their membership, and you talked about colleges, college campuses. Did conservatives learn a serious lesson from those recruiting tactics and practices that we now see manifesting itself in the reaction to the anti-genocidal Gazan protests on college campuses today?
Well, for sure. And in fact, the U.S. ruling class faces a real dilemma. On the one hand, in order to keep up not only with the People's Republic of China, but the allies, competitors in the European Union, the United States needs first-class educational institutions, particularly in the realm of higher education. At the same time, these institutions of higher education, as the aforesaid tends to suggest, tends to generate almost effortlessly a kind of radicalism. And so the question is, how do you square that circle? How do you continue supporting a first-class research so that the United States can remain competitive while suppressing the free thinking that oftentimes generates that first-class research? And now you see part of the effort is reflected in today's headlines, which talks about how Black enrollment at MIT, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, et cetera, has been suppressed in light of the anti-affirmative action decisions. You see this as well in the dilemma the United States faces with China, because what happened in recent years, you had this de facto alliance between China and Washington, is that the United States became heavily dependent upon Chinese graduate students. And so the United States, in really many ways, was training their grave diggers, because the Chinese graduate students were then going back to China. At the same time, they were trying to purge Black graduate students. And so now they're trying to fill the gap by supplanting both with South Asian graduate students, which only tells me that they'll have to confront a South Asian competitor and juggernaut in coming years and decades.
We're at 31. We're at 31 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, and Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. The book is Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne is the author and my guest. Phenomenal research, phenomenal book. And folks, if you really want to get not only the historic insight, but I'm telling you, when you finish this, I haven't finished it yet, but I know when you finish reading this book, you're going to have a much clearer picture on our current circumstance. What's happening with Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the Uhuru 3 in Tampa, Florida, as their trial is ongoing. What's happening with Scott Ritter? What's happening with Professor Danny Shaw? You're going to get an understanding. Jamal Imam Alameen, Jamal Amil Alameen. You're going to get an incredible insight into not only what is happening, but for me, more importantly, the why. And you want to talk about the why? Let's talk about all the things you are. This is from Hawkins, Alive at the Village Gate, 1963 Verve. Do yourselves a favor. Keep it locked right here, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. 36 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, and Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. That's all the things you are. That's from Hawkins, live at the Village Gate 63 Verve release. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. The book, Armed Struggle, Panthers, Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s, is my guest. Phenomenal, phenomenal book. And Dr. Horne, communists, black nationalists, and liberals, how did, through the 60s and the 70s, how did the time in history and the politics of what to many would be disparate groups work to create these politics of struggle?
Well, first of all, as you know, the NAACP was initiated circa 1909, not least by W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1961 joined the U.S. Communist Party, which was initiated post-1917 in the wake of the Russian Revolution and was closely tied to Moscow. There had been a star-crossed relationship between the NAACP and the Communist Party, not least during the 1930s when they crossed swords over the Scottsboro case, the case of 9 embattled Black youth in rural Alabama, being railroaded to the electric chair on malicious and fallacious charges of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American young women. This case, because of the Communist Party, captured international headlines, led to demonstrations at U.S. embassies all over the world, put pressure on the United States that ultimately led to their freedom, and also led to changes in the law per U.S. Supreme Court decisions. But alas, what happens beginning after World War II, ending in 1945, as the United States turns on its erstwhile ally, with which it had collaborated against Hitler in World War II, speaking of the Soviet Union. This leads to a crackdown on forces of the left, including Du Bois, who were thought to be all too close to Moscow. Recall that he was indicted in 1951, handcuffed at the age of 83, because of allegations that his saluting the banning of nuclear weapons was basically a ploy by the Soviet Union. He was barely able to escape prison. The Communist Party leadership, of course, was generally imprisoned at that time. Paul Robeson, the Russophile actor, activist, linguist, had his income fall from the 6 figures to the low 4 figures. And in that vacuum, whereby the Communist Party was being ousted from center stage in their call for socialism, picking up the banner in terms of redistribution of the wealth, this time from top to bottom as opposed from bottom to top, which is what we're enduring today, was the Black Panther Party emerging in the mid-1960s. But alas, it was only one form of Black nationalism. They styled themselves as revolutionary Black nationalists. There were others who were dubbed cultural Black nationalists. The latter, of course, helped to formulate the still extant holiday, Kwanzaa, which is marked at the end of the year, will be marked again at the end of this year. They had murderous confrontations, including on the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers slain. And it's interesting that even though the Communist Party has been weakened and the revolutionary Black nationalists have been more or less interred, cultural nationalists per Kwanzaa still remain on the scene. And the liberals of the NAACP, who battled the Communist Party, battled the Black Panther Party, battled Dr. King, are still very much on the scene.
Are still very much on the scene. And before I get to the still very much on the scene, talk about the actions that the government took to undermine these organizations, which in many on the more violent side, as we understand what happened with many of the Panthers in Chicago, what happened with them in Oakland, what happened with them in Los Angeles, led to armed struggle.
You mentioned Chicago, December 4th, 1969. Fred Hampton slain in his bed in the wee hours of the morning. His comrade Mark Clark slain also by the authorities, captured in the recent Hollywood film Judah and the Black Messiah. Recall that the Panthers drew a distinction between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Armed propaganda, May 1967, their entry into the state legislature in Sacramento, armed to protest passage of impending legislation. Armed self-defense, December 1969 in Los Angeles, where because of the ministrations of Panther leader, then known as Geronimo Pratt, they were able to beat back an armed assault by the notorious LAPD. And armed struggle, referenced already in terms of August 1970 at the Marin County Courthouse north of San Francisco, spearheaded by the precocious teenager Jonathan Jackson. We all know, I'm sure, about COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which unleashed dirty tricks initially against the U.S. Communist Party, then migrated to try to destabilize not only the Black Panther Party, but also Dr. King. Of course, that's represented in the film Selma, you may recall. So the U.S. authorities played a pivotal and instrumental role in helping to shape the political environment of Black America and helping to ensure who would be the survivors and who would not be the survivors.
Quickly, one of the things, a lot of people are very familiar with Oakland, with the Panthers in Oakland, their making the decision to police the police was the tactic that they used because of the brutality that was being inflicted upon citizens, residents of Oakland through very brutal traffic stops and whatnot. But a lot of people don't realize how, and you mentioned this earlier, but I'd like for you to elaborate a little bit. A lot of people don't realize how violent the LAPD were towards people of color in the 50s and the 60s.
Well, I tackled this subject also in my previous book on the Watts Uprising, 1965, the book entitled Fire This Time. And as I pointed out in that book, the curfew zone, or the zone of armed intensity during the aforementioned Watts Uprising, was larger than the city of San Francisco. What's striking about the Southland, Southern California, is how gigantic it is. There are 200 miles separating Santa Barbara from San Diego. That's about the same distance, for example, from New York City to Washington, D.C., for example. And in the center of that geographical area is the city and county of Los Angeles, which at various points employed about 7,000 LAPD officers compared to 38,000 in New York City, which is geographically smaller. And so the LAPD adopted what I call draconian deterrence. They had so much territory to cover.
Wait a minute. Because before you get there, I think it's important to also talk about quickly where a lot of the members of the LAPD came from, where they went to recruit these officers.
Well, obviously in Dixie, obviously out of the U.S. military, where they had been previously roughhousing and manhandling Indo-Chinese and brought those same tactics of brutality to the Southland. But in any case, back to this concept of draconian deterrence, the idea was that you wanted to deter particularly those who were suspected of being disproportionately involved in crime, and you know who that is, you wanted to deter them from having engagements with the police by roughhousing and manhandling those unfortunate enough to have those kinds of engagements. But what that did, of course, was serve as a recruiting broadside for organizations like the Black Panther Party, leading to the Community Alert Patrol, an early attempt to monitor the police the police with cameras, for example, with walkie-talkies, for example. You had similar efforts actually taking place in other cities as well. So this is part of the now forgotten legacy, because you still have the police terror, but you don't have organized bodies seeking to police the police, at least not to the same degree.
This book, Armed Struggle, Black Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. This is history. This is past tense. Are there parallels between the actions taken by the government in the 60s and the 70s and the actions being taken today by the government against organizations and people such as Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the Uhuru Three, right now on trial in Tampa? Scott Ritter, who had his home raided by the FBI about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago now. Professor Danny Shaw, who was stopped and interrogated for 3 hours in the Chicago airport and not allowed counsel. And when he first said he wasn't going to answer questions, he was told, "Well, you're not going anywhere until you do." So, are we seeing parallels between the then and the now?
Oh, indeed, we are, particularly in Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg, where Chairman O'Malley and his comrades in the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement are standing trial precisely because of their internationalism, precisely because of their opposition to the US escapade in Ukraine, which has the potential to ignite World War III. This has echoes of what befell W.E.B. Du Bois in 1951 when he was put on trial in federal court because of an assumed association with Moscow. And I must say that this kind of marauding by the US authorities makes me think that I personally need to escape the jurisdiction of the US federal authorities, perhaps by contemplating exile, which is what Du Bois did when he moved to Ghana in 1961.
So, what are the three most salient points that you want the audience to take away from this phenomenal work? Armed struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. What are the three most salient points that you want the audience to take away from after they finish reading this book?
Well, the need for organization. It's difficult for oppressed groups, particularly people of African descent in North America who have suffered through both enslavement and Jim Crow terror, to advance without organization. Secondly, of course, it's difficult for oppressed groups in this country to advance absent internationalism. That is to say, reaching across the borders and reaching across the oceans to potential allies. And I would hope that the threshold is already there, since people refer to themselves as African Americans, they refer to themselves as being part of the African diaspora. We have an African continent that is moving steadily ahead. And I won't refer to previous comments about Africa's alliances and relationships with China, but it's something that we obviously need to ponder and contemplate. And as well, we need militancy. That sort of in-your-face militancy that I had thought was part of the makeup of Black America, but perhaps I was wrong in that assumption and assertion.
Well, now that's an interesting point, because there was a period of time when there was militancy, but it's when you really, at least to me, start looking at the history, what you find is there was a greater part of the community that was resisting the militancy than the militants themselves. And I think a lot of that was generational in terms of in terms of the age of those. But so you look at the reaction, for example, to Dr. King when he went to the Riverside Church in 1963 and gave his "Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam" speech. The reaction by the community towards him was horrific. We know that the Panthers were not supported by the majority of African Americans. So, is that a fair assessment or critique?
Well, sure. And let's focus for a moment on NAACP, which has been a survivor. not least because it battled the Communist Party, it battled the Black Panther Party, it battled the Nation of Islam. It was like an attack dog in the Black community, being sicked on real or imagined foes of the US ruling elite. And I think that the NAACP really needs to engage in some self-criticism, some honest self-reflection. It needs to apologize, for example, to the family of Paul Robeson. They deserted Paul Robeson. Not only did they desert him, they attacked Paul Robeson when he was at his lowest moment. They tossed Du Bois overboard because of his positions on foreign policy. And so it's difficult to have a progressive Black community when the mass membership organization that's supposed to be like the ANC, the African National Congress of South Africa, a broad church with many different elements sitting in the various pews. But the NAACP tosses out of the pews anybody who do not necessarily adhere to a certain political line, and therefore weakens itself, weakens the Black community, but sails blithely along as if everything is peachy keen and rosy, although it's obviously on the menu to be liquidated next.
In fact, when you talked about organization, my next question on that point was going to be, well, many would say, we have organizations. We have the NAACP. We have the Urban League. We have the Congressional Black Caucus. But to the NAACP, I think it's important for people to remember, and I think I have this history right, they didn't get their first African-American president didn't come until, I want to say, the 70s. And there's historic record showing that Joel Spingarn, who I think was a president of the NAACP and who the most prestigious Spingarn Award is named after, was actually a spy for the FBI.
Well, the NAACP plays a major role in this book. Their records are at the Library of Congress. There are also records on microfilm. I pored over those records in the Library of Congress intently and intensively, which of course forms the basis of a number of chapters in this particular book. And once again, I think that organization needs to engage in some self-reflection, some self-criticism. I don't think we'll be able to go forward as a community until and unless this mass membership organization engages in that kind of self-rectification, because after all, the National Urban League is not a mass membership organization. Assuredly, the Congressional Black Caucus is not a mass membership organization. It's not like any Tom, Diana, or Harry can join the Urban League or join the CBC. And so the NAACP is their natural home, but it has been tossing out members, I would say left and right, but mostly left, for decades. For decades.
You mean, and you mean that they have been purging their membership rolls?
Well, what I mean is that beginning with the Red Scare, post-1945, they began purging their membership. They tossed Du Bois overboard. They tried to purge the NAACP chapter in San Francisco. It was one of the more stalwart chapters under the leadership of the late Dr. Carlton Goodlett, one of the heroes of this book, who was also a physician and a publisher of the San Francisco Sun-Reporter. They, of course, oftentimes worked with anti-communist unions that were racist. They turned their backs on or attacked progressive, pro-Black unions like the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, headquartered in San Francisco. It's striking to note that West Coast Longshore, which controls the ports from Seattle to San Diego, was led by the left, whereas East Coast Longshore, the International Longshore Association, was dominated by gangsters. Guess who the NAACP was more likely to associate with? So this is the kind of history that if you don't know it, you won't understand the maladies and the deficiencies of our community. And you'll come up inevitably with superficial explanations and inadequate remedies.
And I think that understanding this history provides great insight into or answers to the question of why there are now such declining membership rolls for the NAACP, because people don't see them on the front line championing their interests and their causes. And there also seems to have become this acquiescence uh, to to uh, to the business culture, as they gain their support from Pepsi and from Wells Fargo and from other a corporate interests. They're more concerned about placating the corporate interest than they are about addressing the maladies affecting our community.
What's ironic is that grassroots forces here in Southeast Texas struggled long and hard so that professors like myself could get tenured positions and write books and actually be paid, in some cases, rather handsomely. And yet the NAACP, which supposedly represents the Black community, they wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole, even though
Nor I.
here I am in the state of Texas, so far, at least.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Again, folks, the book, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. And as always, look forward to having you back.
Thank you.